Welcome back to the second hour of Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me back, Jay.
Always good to talk to you for a weekly chat and an update on what's happening, what's really happening, for an alternative view of what's taking place in the world as opposed to what our mainstream media gives us all the time. You know, last evening, Daniel, I was sitting out on my patio, my wife and I. It was a beautiful evening here in New York, and our next-door neighbor, who we like a lot, Marianne, she started talking about the current events and the airliner, the Malaysian airline plane that went down, and immediately she started basically saying exactly what I just heard a few minutes earlier on the television inside, that Putin is responsible for the Malaysian aircraft that went down, that Putin provided the missiles that were used to shoot down the aircraft, and that Putin is not trying to stop these horrible people in the eastern Ukraine, the separatists, from interfering with the investigation of the crash in the downed airliner. So I think that she's really, as I say, I think she's just really depending on the mainstream media for her truth, and she doesn't have any reason, she thinks, to suspect that they are not giving it to her straight. But this weekend, I noticed on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity that Ron Paul did write an article. The title of the article was "What the Media Won't Report About the Malaysian Airlines Flight MH17." Can you pass along for our listeners some of the points, some of the things that our media is not reporting that may be very crucial to understanding what really went on in this incident?
Yeah, you're right about everything there, Jay. You know, what is amazing is the preponderance of propaganda, you know, the absolute total dominance of one perspective. You know, it was just minutes after the crash that with one voice Western media proclaimed that Putin did it, with zero evidence. And anytime there's any evidence presented that goes counter to that pre-foregone conclusion, it's simply ignored.
Mm-hmm.
It may well be the case. Maybe they're right. Maybe all of the lies they've told us since Saddam's WMD and before, maybe all that aside, they're right this time.
Yeah. Maybe they're being honest for a change.
Maybe they are, but you would think that the burden of proof would be on them at least. But sadly, for folks like your neighbor and for, you know, unfortunately, the vast majority of Americans, they won't even stop to ponder that because they still believe what's told to them on the nightly news. Although we're both happy to hear that audience is declining and decreasing because more and more people are smelling the BS. I hate to say it that way, but and tuning out. But nevertheless, it still is so dominant. But as you asked, Dr. Paul in his weekly column this week did sort of have looks to me like he had a little fun pointing out that here are the things, you know, the media is propagandizing and telling you what happened. Here's a few things that they're not going to report.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the first ones he points out, which is so important, is that this whole thing started with the EU and the U.S. who were clamoring for regime change. They started in the early 2000s with the Orange Revolution, and they upped the ante with the coup that happened in February. And as he points out, if it wasn't for U.S. and EU meddling in the overthrow of a democratically elected president, you would not have had the violence in the East, where the people in the East say, we don't want to go along with this government put in place in the western part of Ukraine, so we're going to resist. Wouldn't have had that, and you most likely would not have had this plane shot down.
Well, you know, Daniel, that's what Putin said, in fact, after this tragic event. He said if there was peace in the Ukraine, this wouldn't have happened, which is an obvious statement. But then we need to back up, and Americans are not aware, as you said, of what our role has been in destabilizing an elected government over there. People don't know that.
It's true.
I guess we're not supposed to know, what our government or what, people that are behind our government are doing.
Well, they assume that we're stupid. But, the same is true in every other, in all of the other interventions we see now falling apart. They don't want us to know that in Iraq, for example, it's the same ISIS that they're supporting to overthrow Assad that is destroying the country.
Right.
They don't want us to know that the same Islamic rebels in Libya that they backed to overthrow Gaddafi have now taken the airport in Tripoli, have killed some, I think, 40-some people yesterday, and that the place is a total disaster. So they don't want Americans to think about the consequences of the intervention. They immediately want to simply change the topic and point out the Hitler of the day.
Or as they define him.
Yes, as they define him.
You're right. They decide to put the label Hitler on people, whether it's justified or not. And many times it is, I suppose. But then, two wrongs make a right, I suppose.
Sure. There are a lot of bad guys out there, and simply being interested in facts and being skeptical of all governments does not make one on the side of anyone.
But Daniel, you know darn well that our government couldn't be bad. That we have only good people that live in that occupy the White House.
That's right. That's right.
Well, but we have that sense all the time. That's the way we're brought up to believe. I can remember as a young man always knowing for sure that Izvestia and Pravda were the liars, but our people and our media was giving us the straight truth. I always felt that way.
Yeah, it is a shame, but now I guess unfortunately the veil has been lifted from our eyes. I think Iraq did a lot in 2002 and 2003, did a lot for a lot of people to lift the veil, and I think especially for me, after that incident, I really started going back and looking at interventions through history, and you see the same pattern over and over again.
All right, another point that Ron Paul pointed out was that. In terms of the weapons that were used, he says that they will not report that the Ukrainian government also uses the exact same Russian-made weapons that are believed to have brought down the plane.
I know that's a really good one, I think, because the media, at least over the weekend, was going on. We know that the Putin did it because they used Russian weapons.
Yeah.
It shows how ignorant the media is, how ignorant these people are. Of course, Ukraine uses the same weapons because most of them were Soviet weapons.
Yeah.
They were both together as part of the Soviet Union. So of course, Ukraine has these surface-to-air missiles, these sophisticated Buk missiles. They all use them.
Yeah, but of course, the general idea that American people have is that our side, the Ukrainians, it's just the rebels that would have the Russian weapons. It wouldn't be the government that the United States supports.
Yes, exactly, and they had to have been hand-delivered by Putin. And what's amazing is for all of these hundreds of billions of dollars that we spent on intelligence, these are not little suitcase weapons. These launchers are massive, and it's not just on one truck. It has several support trucks as part of a team. It has to have radar backup. I mean, these are seriously sophisticated. Compared to what the rebels had used up until this point, weaponry. So you're telling me that the U.S. does not in possession of any satellite photos, of anything to back up its claims that these were delivered by Putin to the rebels who were instructed on how to use them and told to shoot down a passenger plane. Talk about a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
I'm certainly willing to believe it if they have some evidence, if they have satellite photos, which of course they do have, because as Jane's Defense Weekly tells us, the U.S. has been flying AWACS over the area since March.
Yeah.
So they most certainly do have this information. Why are they withholding it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. Another point that Dr. Paul pointed out, that one of the things they will not tell us is that Kiev has, according to some monitors that follow the situation, killed some 250 people in the breakaway Lugansk region since June, including 20 killed as government forces bombed the city center the day after the plane crash. So 250 people that Kiev has been responsible for killing is almost the same number of people that were brought down in the aircraft.
That's just in Lugansk. As of Monday, which is very interesting, as all the attention is on whether the investigators will get through and be able to conduct an investigation, which it looks like they have done, despite what Obama claims. But as this is happening, everyone's discussing this. The Kiev forces are shelling Donetsk, which is a city of 1 million people, and they've killed already dozens of civilians in Donetsk. Nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about the fact that I think it was on Monday, Kiev completely blew up the administrative center in the city of Lugansk.
Wow.
They're using these Grad rockets on civilian targets, not unlike what's happening over in Gaza. but simply no one is paying attention because the U.S. media is completely ignoring it. So the idea that they have any scruples about decimating a civilian population should be swept aside by their behavior.
Right, and hence then, why it sort of beats me, Daniel. Why are those 250 people in the breakaway Lugansk region of little or no concern to us, whereas the people on that aircraft are?
Sure, and the same was with civilians in Iraq when the U.S. invaded, and so on and so on. These are just collateral damage.
Yeah, America kills so many people in these wars. It's not reported. We don't, of course, report very much anymore our own soldiers that come back either. That, as during the Vietnam days, that was always reported how many people died, but we don't get that news anymore. We're not supposed to know.
No, that's not good.
Another point, they will not report that the U.S. has strongly backed the Ukrainian government in these attacks on civilians, which the State Department spokesman called measured and moderate. Just as you're saying, we are measured and moderate. We don't do bad things, and maybe once in a while a person dies, but that's too bad, and we're very, very, very sorry about that. But no, we treasure human life, and so.
Yeah, this was the State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki, who was really sort of the chemical Ali of U.S. foreign policy. You know, if you remember the fellow in the Iraq War who kept doing these outrageous briefings that everyone knew were so completely fabricated. I mean, that's the role that she's taken, and this was an extraordinary moment in a State Department briefing where one brave reporter had the courage to actually mention all of these civilian deaths that were taking place at the hands of the U.S.-backed government in Kiev, and she said, well, we think that government's response is measured and moderate.
Yeah. Well, here's one that Ron says that they won't report that I believe, Daniel, I've heard someone just a few minutes ago on CNBC actually reporting or making this statement, and that is that they will not report that neither Russia or the separatists in eastern Ukraine have anything to gain but everything to lose by shooting down a passenger liner. I actually, in all fairness to the media that I listened to here a few minutes ago, somebody after President Obama spoke actually came out and said it hardly seems that the separatists or Putin would really want this to happen, because what it's really doing is stimulating a lot of anger against Russia that wasn't there before, and certainly there was a lot of resistance in Europe to the sanctions that President Obama was pushing for, right? So
yeah, there won't be any more.
There won't be. What was that? There won't be
any more resistance. As a matter of fact, the Dutch have already talked about going in and invading Russia or something. So they're clearly, all of this has melted away at this point.
So if you look at this thing logically, then you could make a case for geopolitically this being a fantastic coup for the United States and for the people that want to pin Putin back and to take over the Ukraine.
Well, this is also a great coup for the very shaky government in Kiev,
right,
that was put into place by the U.S. As a matter of fact, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the prime minister who was the favorite of Victoria Nuland, if you remember in that intercepted conversation, he's already been making the rounds using this to political advantage. He said in the July 21st LA Times, he said, quote, Russia trained these bastards and supported them and even orchestrated this despicable crime. And then he went on to say, this is a global threat and Russia is on the dark side.
Right.
The priority of the world should be to stop Russian aggression. And here's what's interesting is that President Obama had a press conference the same day that these comments were released. And what Yatsenyuk said completely tracks with what Obama said. He said, this is not just a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. This is an international and global conflict. And that is almost word for word what Obama said. Wow. And I think this represents an enormous escalation, and I think it's paving the way for a global confrontation to say that, hey, this isn't between Russia and Ukraine anymore. This is all of a sudden a threat to the entire international community.
Wow.
It's chilling.
What a big lie. I mean, that's just ridiculous. But it strikes me, Daniel, as though if the separatists and Putin could not have given the Ukrainian government and the United States, the Anglo-American Empire, a bigger gift than they did if they were responsible for that. I mean, they couldn't have done something more stupid for their own cause.
Yeah, if it was a terrible, tragic mistake,
Right.
then you're right, because no matter what that was, it would have been handed. If it were something intentional, I just
how would it be?
What would be the point?
Yeah.
But you know what the Western media does is it demonizes the hated person of the day, whether it's Assad or Hussein or anyone.
Right.
You demonize them to the point where the American people, or at least a lot of them, believe that person is totally irrational.
Right.
So irrational, crazy people do crazy things.
Right.
Why did Putin personally shot down the plane? Because he's crazy.
Right.
That's why.
And he's full of hatred. Not unlike us. We're loving and caring people.
He's full of hatred and he's crazy. That's why he did it.
Yeah.
It's so bizarre. The propaganda is so shocking that you almost feel like you're living in an alternative reality.
Yeah. Anything else that Ron pointed out here? I think there's something about the missile that apparently shot down the plane was from a sophisticated surface-to-air missile system that requires a good deal of training, and the Separatists do not have that training. Do we know that for sure? The Separatists are not trained to use these sophisticated weapons?
Well, they would have had significant Russia training, or they would have had to have had a lot of experience in using these weapons beforehand. But, this is basically a ragtag army. Some of them do have military training because they do have conscription, but this is very specialized training. So in the course of, say, 6 weeks or so that this has been ongoing into this intensity, you would have had to have some very, very significant training of these sort of ragtag militias and how to operate these things. So it's very, and they've also been having pretty good success using these shoulder-fired missiles against Ukrainian transport planes and jets that are flying lower.
Yes.
But you also have to wonder what is the point of having something like that when typically jet fighters do not fly at those altitudes.
Right. Yeah, I mean it doesn't make a lot of sense. Another thing, they will not report that the separatists in the eastern Ukraine have inflicted very considerable losses on the Ukrainian government. No, we don't hear that, do we? We don't hear that the separatists sometimes have been successful militarily. We don't hear much about that, but that would have given the Ukrainian government some motives for retribution.
Desperation.
And desperation.
This is where it really tracks with what happened, if you remember, last summer in Syria. The scenario is almost shockingly similar. The forces of President Assad had made some serious inroads against the U.S.-backed rebels in Syria, and that was the point. As they were winning, and they've continued to win since then, but as they began really winning this thing, that's when this so-called gas attack in Ghouta occurred. And that's where the U.S. had the red line, and we were ready to go to war with Syria over this. It was the exact same scenario, and it was the exact same question of who benefits. Why on earth, just as he's gaining the upper hand, would Assad do something that would make him so reviled by the international community? Right.
I recall that, yes.
And it's the same thing now. See, what happened in Ukraine over the past week was that Poroshenko, the president, announced a surprise attack, and what he was trying to do was to outflank the Ukrainian, the separatists in the east by shoving his troops between the border of Russia and where the separatists had their sort of stronghold, and they were going to try to strangle him. But what happened is that the separatists were able to anticipate this attack, and they had about 5,000 forces from Kiev trapped between the Russian border and the areas that they held. And this was threatening to be a rout. And this is actually the scenario just a day or two before the shoot-down. Was this threatened rout of an enormous amount of troops from Kiev.
Yeah, it really does raise an awful lot of questions, Daniel. They will not report, another thing that Ron Paul pointed out, they will not report how similar this is to last summer's, well, that's exactly what you were saying, the similarity with Assad. And the Syrian situation, and how once the other side was making some real progress is when we were able, or I don't know if we were able, if I'm putting it the right way, the events took place that really turned the opinion against Assad, and in this case against the rebels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very very interesting parallels. The other thing that's interesting about that's somewhat of a parallel is there was an extraordinary media briefing on Monday by a senior member of the Russian military staff, complete with satellite photos, with information from air traffic control showing that the forces of Kiev were using. They detected a Sukhoi fighter just right underneath the plane moments before it disappeared from the sky. They also showed that the missiles were fired from area that had been controlled by the Ukrainian government, by Kiev. But now the response of Obama yesterday after this was simply to echo the point that he made after the Syria attack, which is the people on the ground are interfering with the international investigation. What do they have to hide?
Yeah. Who's hiding what is the real question.
And interestingly enough, by the way, the Russians yesterday did say to the Americans, "We know you have these satellite images. Please release them."
Right.
I mean,
and the Russians have them, and they have released them.
They have released them.
But of course, they're not. That's not being told either in our press. We're not seeing those.
Yeah.
And those are not being commented on from. Of course, they coming from Russia, Daniel. They couldn't be truthful.
That's right.
Truth only comes from the United States.
And of course, if the Russians did it, they would lie and try to cover it up.
Of course.
That's what anyone. They wouldn't say, "Yeah, we did it. It wasn't great."
Right.
Of course they would.
Right.
But let's have the facts. Let's have the U.S. present its intelligence, present what it has, what it's holding, so that we can try to decide.
But Daniel, the idea that Obama was saying that essentially that the investigation is being hampered and not being allowed to go forward, its integrity has been compromised, would then always give us an excuse, essentially, to say, well, you can't know what the truth is.
Yeah, exactly. So even if a smoking gun comes up, they can deny it by saying...
They can just say, a smoking gun comes up. Well, how do you know that that's true? Because they've compromised the investigation.
Yeah.
Another very interesting article at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, and listeners, I would really strongly suggest you go there because there's an awful lot of material in this one that was written by Paul Craig Roberts, an economist and a blogger who was a high-level official in the Reagan administration, writes a great website, and I would encourage you to go there too directly, but the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity has an article that he wrote this past weekend called What Happened to the Malaysian Airliner? And Paul Craig Roberts gives some very provocative, very interesting thoughts about it, but I think is very highly logical in the way he sets out his arguments and his basically saying that it could be a false flag. Daniel, would you care to comment a little bit on Paul Craig Roberts' article?
Well, I thought it was a great article, as are many of his articles. I don't know whether it was a false flag or not, but it certainly would fit in with the pattern. I mean, certainly the first question to ask is who benefits and who doesn't benefit. And if just that question alone should raise a red flag.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's an article I think is very well worth reading, and I think he lays out some very, very considerable questions that are not being asked by our media. We don't ask questions. Our media doesn't ask questions. It just gives you the truth. It regurgitates what is told to them on high, from on high, and then we are supposed to just like sheeple follow it, believe it, trust it, pay our taxes, shut our mouths, and be good citizens, right? It sounds a little contrary to the Constitution, but...
Well, it's also dangerous for journalists who want to try to buck the trend, I mean, hopefully I didn't tell this story before, but I remember when I was a journalist working in Eastern Europe, and I saw a coup in one of those countries happen, and everything was totally the opposite of the way it was being reported. I ran into an AP friend of mine, and I told her what I'd just seen in the field, and she said, but nobody else is reporting that.
Yeah.
So that's why would I stick my neck out? Why would I something that goes against all of my colleagues? It's not good for your career.
Yeah. Well, this is along those lines, Daniel. In the article from Paul Craig Roberts, he says, look around for still honest journalists. Who are they? Glenn Greenwald, who is under constant attack by his fellow journalists, all of whom are whores. Who else can you think of that are honest journalists? Julian Assange, Well, he's locked away in the Ecuadorian embassy in London on Washington's orders. And he goes on to say the British puppet government won't permit free transit to Assange to take up his asylum in Ecuador.
Yeah,
So the last country that did this was the Soviet Union, which required its Hungarian puppet to keep Cardinal Mindzensky interred in the U.S. Embassy in Budapest for 15 years from 1956 to 1971. And then it says that Mindzensky was granted political asylum by the United States, but Hungary, on Soviet orders, would not honor his asylum, just as Washington's British puppet, on Washington's orders, will not honor Assange's asylum. And then he says, and I think this is really a good way to end this discussion today, perhaps, but he says, if we are honest and have the strength to face reality, we will realize that the Soviet Union did not collapse. It simply moved along with Mao and Pol Pot to Washington and London. My goodness, what a statement. But I have been feeling this, Daniel, that is what's happening, that we have become the Soviet Union in so many ways. We are moving in that direction, it seems to me, very rapidly.
But not we, Jay, the government. That's the one thing I would.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. But, you know, we are complicit in it, in that we, the citizens, aren't more concerned than we are, I think.
It's not unpatriotic to point it out. On the contrary, it is the most patriotic thing to point out.
Absolutely.
Is defying its own principles.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the forces of history, we'll have to wait and see. But Daniel, I think it's all about speaking up for what's true, and I mean that's what we have to do. I think. I mean, I'm driven by that. I know you are. I know Dr. Paul is for sure. A lot of good people are. Paul Craig Roberts certainly, and those journalists that come forth. Some people, for whatever the reasons, it's their genes or whatever. They are people. Some people feel compelled to tell the truth, even when it might be not very self-serving. But I want to thank you, Daniel, for your efforts. Anything else to add before we end our conversation today?
I just hope and pray that this does not escalate further, because this is incredibly, incredibly terrifying, and I don't think people realize the consequences of what Washington is up to.
No, I don't think people do either, and the sense that we are omnipotent. And, of course, omniscient, our president. That's the idea. We don't question anything he says. And then also, Daniel, what concerns me greatly, and we're going to talk to David Jensen in the next segment about this, but the idea that this comes on the heels of the BRIC announcement of setting up a competing currency regime. And I believe very definitely that the United States, with its sanctions against Russia, is pushing Russia into the arms of China. And some of the other nations that are not so comfortable with the notion of a one world government that's being sought clearly by people, by NATO and the people that are the forces behind that. So, I mean, I guess there's nothing new in history, Daniel. Empires have always tried to get as much as they could and push the envelope, push their control globally if possible, right? So this is nothing new in history, right? But there comes an end to it at some point.
Well, we're broke, so that might be the end.
Yeah, and the end may not be very comfortable as we sit here in America right now, enjoy our still good life. But we, as you say, I share your hopes and prayers that this doesn't escalate further. Somehow, God on high can intervene and keep this thing from spinning out of control, because it looks to me very, very dangerous. I want to thank you again, Daniel, very much for sharing your time and your thoughts and your insights with our listeners. I look forward to talking to you again in the near future, next week, hopefully.
Thanks for having me, Jay.